The Essential Education projector range from Hitachi sponsors ICT programs.
We're going to start off and just have a think about what we can do with the Easy Teach software.
Simon Botton is very experienced with whiteboards. Now he's going to pass on his top tips to new users.
First thing you've got to consider when you're buying a whiteboard is really horses for courses. Think about the users who are going to use your whiteboard, their age, where it's going to be placed, who's going to be using it. I've got a solid surface board which you need a pen for. It uses an electromagnetic pulse and basically copies where the mouse would go. 0.05, what would that look like as a fraction? Have a go. Now the advantages of these are that the screen is very durable, and if you damage the board itself it's quite easy to replace the screen. The pen's relatively cheap. If you lose it they're about £10 to replace. Some of the boards that have a pen, the pens are substantially more, up to £90, £100, so obviously you don't want to go losing one of those. That works by being touch sensitive, and you can actually just use your finger to be the mouse. Now that can be really nice if you're working with younger children, and it's very touch sensitive, very touchy-feely, and the young children really do love coming out and moving the teddy bears onto the counting or whatever else, and it's really nice in that way.
All you've got to do is turn your hand backwards to the screen. Just lay your thumbnail even on the top of the word you want to move, and then it'll just go. Okay, if you press too hard, what happens is your fingers bounce along the screen, and every time your finger leaves the screen, you drop it.
What you have to be a little bit careful with on those is you can damage those screens quite easily. They've got some kind of gel underneath, and if you rip them or tear the surface, then they're quite expensive to replace. But, as I say, if you're working with young children and you want something that's very hands-on, very personal, it's perfect.
Give it back! It's mine! Give it back! Get off! It's mine! Get off! Give it back!
Given that technology is going more and more wireless, and that within 5 years ICT suites will be completely obsolete, the classroom boards are what's going to survive. Laptops will be in the classroom, ICT suites with rooms full of computers will be gone. Now, for many schools, putting a board in every classroom simply isn't feasible in one go. To equip a whole school is something in the region of £20,000, and not many schools have got that much money lying around their budgets. So, for many schools, they might consider buying maybe 2 boards at a go. Now, if you're going to do that, the temptation is to put 1 board in each year group. However, research from BET shows that if you're going to buy multiple boards, it's much better to put 2 in the same year group. The reason being that it allows the teachers in that year group then to share resources. It means that they're learning together and that they can share tips and expertise as they go along.
This afternoon we've all got interactive whiteboards, and obviously my job is to make sure that everybody's using them. And I recognise that within the school there's different levels of ability and how they're using them. The first thing I think is to get a person interested, and if they're interested they will use it. The second thing is to make it easy and accessible to them. And hopefully once they realise how powerful the whiteboard will be, they'll just use it more and more and more.
When we first got the whiteboards, they were absolutely fantastic, although there was one problem. I'm not very tall and they were installed far too high, so I couldn't reach the top. And if I couldn't reach the top, there was no way the kids were going to be able to reach the top.
My board is over here, which was where the original whiteboard was before I had this installed. I have windows on either side of my classroom. I have windows over here which don't cause much of a shadow problem. But again, if I had the board, say, over here, for a start, if you're over that side of the class, you wouldn't have a chance of seeing it. And also, it would cause the children to have conflicting lights coming onto their eyes. Over here, we have sun coming in during the afternoon, and there is still, wherever you put your board, going to be an issue with that. The sun comes to about, I suppose, about here. So it doesn't really cause much of a nuisance, but you may consider, if you've got bright sunlight coming into your room, a lot of modern schools have very large windows, which is lovely. You may want to think about, will you need blinds? Likewise, if you've got any skylights, you may want to think about some way of covering those or making sure that they don't interfere with the projection of the board. The other things to consider is the size of the board and how high it is. If you've got younger children, you may want to place the board lower down than we have here. I have a friend who's a teacher who's under 5 foot, and she can't reach the top of the board. Now, as all the Microsoft controls are on the top, that's a bit of a problem, so she has to have a little step. So think about who's going to be using it, the users.
I started off really simply by using it purely as a display thing, and then when I got a bit more confident with the different functions that you can use, like using a highlighter pen, underlining, annotating, using different nifty things, then I used more and more. And now I'm a bit more confident with how the board works. I've started to look into using more exciting things, like I used internet resources quite a lot, CD-ROMs, things like that. So bit by bit, that's how you've got to look at it.
My idea of whiteboard hell is when you actually walk into the room, dock your machine, plug the plug into the background, and everything works, but you can't get things to happen. That is my idea of hell, especially when you've got a lesson prepared and you've got 30 seconds in which to sort it out.
90% of the problems I'm asked to deal with, people's boards not working, relate to wires being put in the wrong place. It's simply because probably someone's unplugged it. Somewhere on your board there will be a light to show that it's got power. Check that light first. Check your wires, check that everything's plugged in, and 9 times out of 10 you will solve the problem. Like any piece of electronic equipment, sometimes it might break down, and it's very important to have a plan B up your sleeve. Now, if you come into your class one day, which we all have, and suddenly it's not working for whatever reason, blind panic tends to ensue for a matter of seconds. After that, you've got to think, OK, what can I do to get this working again? First of all, switch everything off. Projector off, the board off, the laptop off. Then switch them on again, but make sure you switch on the laptop last. That usually solves the problem. If that still doesn't solve the problem, then you may have a technical fault which might require assistance. In the short term, it's sometimes useful, and what a lot of teachers have been asking me, is if they can have a small whiteboard which you just write on with a normal pen next to their interactive board. It means that if the worst comes to the worst, you've always got that there as a little backup.
You can't expect it to happen overnight. It's got to be a gradual thing, and you can't just turn around and expect a teacher that finds it very difficult to use a computer to suddenly use this all the time. Their confidence has got to be built gradually, so you can't have too high expectations too quickly.
When I got my first whiteboard, I was really terrified. I just didn't know what to do, so I did nothing. The whiteboard stayed on the wall for what must have been about 2 weeks. Looking back, it seems really stupid, but at the time I was really scared.
When you put the new boards into school, you can't just magically expect people to know how to use them. They are a very different way of working than perhaps a lot of people have been used to. You have to think a bit more carefully about training and how you're going to get staff up to speed with these boards. Initially, the people who supply the board should come in and give you some free training.
We're all going to come up and have a go at some time on the board, just so we've all got a feel for using it and a little bit of confidence by the end of the session. Normally, if this computer was just in the classroom, it would be useful, but it's certainly not a whole class teaching resource, is it? The board is attached to the computer as well, and basically when I put the pen on the board, you see it picks up the cursor, and I'm actually now able to move the cursor around the board.
The only slight problem is that they'll show you their software and their software alone. If you want to start expanding things, you might want to think about what training comes after that. Now, it's probably best to leave a period after that initial training has gone in to let people get used to using the basics. If you overload people too much at the beginning, then they'll just run scared from the board because it'll just seem too daunting. One thing that we've done here, which is one way of looking at it, is to think about, once you've had the initial training going in from the company or the LEA or whoever else has been doing it, to then sit down and think, OK, what training do we need as a school? And building some training time in staff meetings with a smaller group where you can ask the sort of questions that perhaps you want to ask in a big group. Now, the problem we're having is, what our whiteboards are starting to look like is this. And they're starting to really become just glorified flip charts. And that's a case everywhere. And it's how we can start moving away from just having sequences of sheets or visuals and actually starting to get the children to interact with them. You've got down here...
It's actually really, really, really simple to use. It's just like using a computer screen, really. So if you're reasonably confident with computers, then it's pretty straightforward to use. When
you get your new board, it's very important that you think about where you're going to stand when you're doing it. you have to remember that whatever you're writing is projected onto your back whilst you're doing it. You also got to think about you're obscuring the view of children while you're doing that. So wherever you can, try and alternate where you're standing. If you stand purely at one side of the board and just work from there, then any child who's behind you, over your shoulder, is going to have an obscured view. So best to try and vary where you are. Move yourself around every few seconds, write what you need to write. Make sure that you're not obscuring anyone's view, then move around again. It's also better for your eyes. As I say, never look straight into the bulb of the projector because it could do your eyes quite serious damage. So if you can avoid that glare during the day, then, as I say, it's good for you in the long run. If I just brush against the board with my pen, I don't get any recognition. I need to push it, I need to show the movement very clearly so that the sensors can pick it up. Again, most of the times when teachers have problems with the board not working is when they're very gently touching the board. You'll find actually the children have no such problems. They'll come up quite happily, and what you have to avoid is them stabbing a hole through it and carving their name in it. But yeah, you need to show it as boss. You need to make sure that you're making very definite actions, especially if you're using something like handwriting recognition software. You can't afford to be very tentative.
When I first started using the board, I didn't realise that I should tell the children that if you use a pen, you have to use a specific pen. And I asked one child to go and highlight on the board using a pen. I was looking at the class. They picked up the wet wipe and they had written all over the board. It was the only board we had in the school. The head wasn't too pleased.
When you first get your board, many people guard them quite jealously. And there is a temptation, though you've got a very expensive piece of kit in your classroom, that you tend to keep the children at a wide berth from it. Now, you've got to think, this is really for their benefit, not yours. And getting the children up at the front, showing you what they've done, manipulating the various models is the best way for this to work. It is a great way to get those reluctant learners out to the front, showing you their learning, in a way that you couldn't possibly get from just writing on a traditional whiteboard.
It's much more exciting for the children if you actually use it as an interactive whiteboard instead of just a display board. It motivates children to come out and, you know, write on the board, and you can see them trying to sit there really nicely so they get chosen to come out and do it. So yeah, it's really good.
Very quickly. I don't think I'll be able to cope without one. I think they just work the way that I like to work, so they're just there, and they're just such a good resource, and so visual and so easy. And of course you keep everything, and if you've got the same year group, you just pull it up again. You don't have to redo it. And I think with all the images available on the internet and even software that's available now for children, it's just, there's no going back, I don't think.
Teachers think it's very important that every child should interact. 30 children, that is. The first child does it brilliantly. Second child, again. And then the third child probably has a problem with the finger slipping, and so action starts slowing down. By the time you get to the 30th child, I find the children at the back having a quiet doze at the back of the classroom.
One thing you've got to consider is, what is the learning aim in my classroom? What is the lesson objective? It's very simple to get very attractive programs off the internet or programs on CD-ROM which take you through learning in a very sequential manner. Now, as we all know, learning is not a sequential business. You might get from A to B, but you might visit C, D and E on the way. If you've actually built the lesson yourself, you know exactly what the prior learning has been and what you want the children to achieve at the end of it. So, wherever possible, think, OK, I want to build this lesson for myself. We don't really need to use very flashy software that we can buy, which doesn't actually, in the final analysis, do much apart from look pretty.
Essential education projectors from Hitachi sponsor ICT programs.